Episode 67, The Church in the Dark Ages, Part 5, End of an Era? Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. Go over to agorapodcastnetwork.com to find more great, thought-provoking, and independent podcasts. You can learn more about the history of the papacy and my new show about the backstory of movies beyond the big screen at a2zhistorypage.com. You can connect and like all the social media from there and link to iTunes where you can leave a rating and review. I would like to welcome 2 new patrons on patreon.com/papacy. We have Joran at the Constantinople level, who will have to tell me how closely I got to pronouncing his name correctly. I think I'm close, but I'm not sure. We also have Peter, who has ascended to the power and prestige of Rome, gaining the title Peter the Great. Thank you to both of you for signing up. Speaking of great people named Peter, today we welcome Dr. Peter Adamson of the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps podcast on the show. I invited Peter on the show so we could really dig into the works of Boethius and how he set the stage for the way Western Christian scholars would think for basically 1,500 years. Boethius still has influence through thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, just as one example. We discuss whether Boethius marked the beginning of something new or the end of an era. Listen all the way to the end because we have a bonus conversation on some recent research done by Dr. Adamson on some papal issues that we touched upon in earlier episodes. I think you will enjoy. A huge shout out to our Rome level patron, Peter the Great, our Constantinople level patrons on patreon.com/papacy, Regan, Sandy, Andy, Paul, Dr. Jeff, Robert, Sean, and now Joran, as well as our Alexandria level patrons, Chris and Francine. To learn more, support the show, or participate in the listener poll, go to the website a2zhistorypage.com. I really sincerely appreciate you taking the time to listen, and I look forward to seeing you on our next stop on our trip through the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Today, of course, we're joined by Peter Adamson of the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps podcast. It's a podcast that's covering, the title is very descriptive. It's covering philosophy without any gaps, covering many different eras. Thank you, Peter, so much for joining us today. It took a little bit of logistics, but we finally did get to talk.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on, Steve. We are on 2 different continents, so it's a miracle that is happening at all. If I'm allowed to use the word miracle on this podcast so loosely.
Peter, can you tell us a little bit about your background and a little bit about your podcast?
Sure. Well, I was really educated as a philosopher at Williams College in Massachusetts, and then the University of Notre Dame is where I got my PhD, also in the States, obviously. Go Irish. And then when I finished my PhD in the year 2000, I moved to London, and I was a philosophy professor there until 2012. I'm still connected to them, but my main job is that I work at the LMU in Munich, so the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich. And actually, my main areas of expertise are ancient and medieval philosophy, but especially Arabic philosophy. So philosophy in the Islamic world, as I usually like to say. And in fact, my title in Munich is Professor of Late Ancient and Arabic Philosophy.
Well, that's great. That's definitely a wide lens, and so you get to see a lot of different aspects of the field, which must be nice.
Yeah, and in fact, that's kind of why I got into the podcasting idea, because I was myself listening to a lot of podcasts, and especially history podcasts, but also philosophy podcasts, because I'm so sad that actually spend my free time listening to more philosophy. And I just kind of noticed that there was no podcast that approached the history of philosophy the way that some of these history podcasts. So my model was especially Mike Duncan's the History of Rome podcast. Um, so I just noticed that there were no podcasts that approached the history of philosophy like that. And since my area is ancient and medieval philosophy, I knew that I would be in a pretty good position to try to do that, at least through the end of the Middle Ages. And actually, I'm getting to the end of the Middle Ages now, but I'm coming up on 300 episodes. So it's taken a while. I've been doing it for, well, since 2010. So it's coming up on 7 years.
Oh, wow. So you're an original podcaster too.
Actually, it's funny you say that, because when I got into it, one of the doubts I had was, oh, is this technology already going to be on the way out? Are people still going to be downloading podcasts in 5 years or whatever? I mean, I also didn't know how long I would do it or want to do it or be able to do it. But if anything, podcasts have come on since then. So we've had like these hit podcasts since then, like that one about the crime story whose name escapes me.
Yeah, a lot of them. It really has seemed to taken a pretty sharp increase even in the last year or two.
Right. So I was afraid that I was getting in at the sort of tail end of the phenomenon, but it turned out that I was getting in while it was still exploding.
Let's dive right in and talk about, before we talk about Boethius himself, what was the state of philosophy in the early 500s? That's a time period where the Roman Empire, at least in the Western end, is in decline and education is in decline. But what kind of educational and philosophical milieu would he be in?
I think one thing about Boethius is that people tend to understand him with the benefit of hindsight. So they think he, sort of like you just said, that he must be living through a very upsetting time where the medieval age is beginning, the Roman Empire's glories are fading very quickly, and he must have been looking around him and thinking, oh no, this is a catastrophe. I have to put some of this classical philosophy into Latin, which is what he did, as we'll hear in a minute, before it all is kind of erased by history. But I don't think that's how he would have seen it at all, actually. It is true that actually, right around the time of his birth, probably just before, a few years before he was born, we have the last Roman emperor in the West. But there is still the Eastern emperor, the Byzantine emperor, and there is a pretty stable political ruler in Italy as well. So we had the Gothic rulers, including the Gothic ruler who put him to death eventually in Italy. So it's not like everything's fragmenting and we've already got, let's say, the rise of feudalism or anything. He's not living through what could, by any stretch of the imagination, be called a dark age. And in terms of philosophy, actually, he's really able to respond to some developments that are more or less exactly contemporaneous with him. And probably the main development that we need to bear in mind here is what's going on in the city of Alexandria in Egypt. There had been philosophy going on there since way back when. So Philo of Alexandria, who's an important early Jewish philosopher and one of the first to write philosophical commentaries on the Bible, if not the first, obviously the Hebrew Bible in his case, he lived in Alexandria, and he's only one of many important philosophers who either came from Alexandria or worked in Alexandria. And in the century leading up to Boethius's career, we have a school of Aristotelian Platonist commentators, especially gathered around a philosopher named Ammonius, who wrote all these commentaries on the classic works of philosophy, especially Aristotle, and within that, especially Aristotle's Logic. And if you look at Boethius's works, you can see that he's reading them. So he's drawing a lot of material from these Greek commentaries. He himself was able to benefit from a very good education in both Latin and Greek. He reads very widely in both languages. And you can tell from the Consolation of Philosophy, for example, how widely he has read. And so I think the takeaway message from all of that is that he's living in a time where it's still possible to access a wealth of information about classical philosophy, and the kind of dark ages medieval period that's to come is really for him not even a kind of gathering threat. It's something that he probably didn't foresee at all.
What would his education have been? There is a little bit of controversy of exactly where he was educated, but what would his education have looked like?
It would have been a pretty standard late Roman imperial education. So he does come from the West. He lives in Italy, and he would have been trained in what was then called the liberal arts, which would have included logic and also rhetoric. And we see that coming out in his works very much, most obviously logic, because he writes about logic extensively. He comments on Aristotle's logical works. Rhetoric comes out more in the way that he writes. So he uses standard rhetorical forms in the Consolation, among other places. But also, some of his logical works are actually on themes that are related to rhetoric. So, for example, he wrote a work on the concept of topics, and topics are basically arguments that you can use in a rhetorical debate or in a rhetorical speech. So he would have had this very kind of linguistic and logical training that really is common to all late ancient intellectuals.
It's interesting you say that he was in a time where it was still rooted in the classical age, and that our idea of the dark ages really hadn't happened yet. At this point, had theology and philosophy melded together, or were they still considered separate?
Well, he's a really important figure there because he is one of the people who writes on theology from a philosophical perspective. And for that reason, he's sometimes treated as being the first medieval philosopher. But before him, you have other so called church fathers in both Greek and Latin who have been doing the same kind of thing for hundreds of years. So, I mean, you can go back to early Latin church fathers like Tertullian, for example, or you could think of St. Augustine, who is probably the most important theologian maybe in the history of Christianity. And he was very influenced by philosophy. In fact, he traces his conversion to Christianity in part to being exposed to philosophical works from the Platonic tradition. And Boethius is aware of these works, as well as other writers like Victorinus, for example. So Boethius would not have seen himself as a pioneer in that respect, even though, from our point of view, he's one of the first people to write about theology in a philosophical way in Latin. So we might see him in a way as being a pioneer. By the way, one sort of upshot of all that is that when people teach Boethius in university courses, which maybe isn't that frequent, but when they do teach him, they would almost always teach him at the beginning of a course on medieval philosophy. And the same thing is true of Augustine, who's even earlier, right? So that, in a way, is fair because Augustine and Boethius are crucial background for understanding medieval philosophy, but it gets them wrong in a really crucial way because they don't live in a medieval world. They live in a late Roman world, and their whole way of seeing the philosophical system, political affairs, etc., that's all shaped by being in a world where for example, the Roman Senate still exists, or the Roman Empire is still a going concern.
Can you give us just a very brief biography of Boethius from his, we've talked about his education, but what was his main career? And he didn't have a very happy ending to his life.
No, sadly not.
What was the short story of his life to give us maybe a little context about his written works?
Well, he was born around 480, and this actually puts him 4 years after the death of the last Roman emperor in the West, that is. So he comes into a situation where the West is now being ruled by the Goths, and he's a well-born kind of gentleman or patrician, and he also marries very well. into a family with a powerful and influential father-in-law named Symmachus. So he's very wealthy. He has a big library. In the Consolation, he describes how nice his library is. And also his sons were able to go on to high political office. He himself held a high office and was a member of the Senate. And so you can sort of think of him as a kind of figure at court as well as an intellectual. And of course, it's the being a figure at court part that runs him into trouble. To make a long story short, what happens is that someone accuses one of the other senators of betraying Theodoric, the Gothic ruler of Italy, by communicating with the Eastern Emperor. And you have to bear in mind here that the rulers in the West are always worried that the Eastern Emperor might try to restore the unity of the empire by taking their power away, right? So Boethius then, perhaps bravely and nobly, but in the end unwisely, speaks up on behalf of this poor senator whose name was Albinus, and says basically, he didn't betray you. We stand with him. And so, of course, Theodoric turns around and has both of them imprisoned and eventually killed. And he was put in jail for several years, during which time he wrote his most famous work, which is called The Consolation of Philosophy. As it sounds like, it's a treatise in which philosophy actually appears to him in the form of a woman and consoles him, basically to help him face the fate that he's just been given through this unjust ruler. And then he's put to death probably in 425 or 6.
In those intervening years, he had a career that was maybe 20, 25 years long, and he has a bibliography that would make a lot of modern academics jealous that he's written so much during that time. What were some of the works that he wrote during that, his main part of his career?
So they really fall into two categories. So if you add the Consolation, there's basically 3 kinds of work by Boethius. So eventually there's the Consolation. But before that, you have these two other kinds of work. One is translations of and commentaries on Aristotle. He announces at one point in his writings that he has the plan of translating all of Plato and Aristotle into Latin, but he obviously doesn't get that far, in part thanks to being executed, but also it's not like he was going at a rate where he was going to finish that anyway. And I guess that one reason why he goes slow is that he doesn't just translate the works, he writes commentaries on them. And he even writes more than one commentary on the same text. So he comments on it, goes off, thinks about it some more, comes back and writes another commentary. He does that with a couple of works on logic by Aristotle. He also writes independent treatises on logic. So this is quite a formidable output. You have translations, commentaries, and independent treatises all on philosophy. And I guess the projected sort of ambition would eventually have been to do that for the whole philosophical curriculum. But what we've got is works on logic. That makes sense, by the way, because in antiquity, as I was sort of just saying with the liberal arts, you tended to start with basic rules of reasoning and speaking and the study of language. And so all philosophy students began with logic. Hence, it makes a lot of sense that he began his commenting and translation project with logic. Parenthetically, this is very important for later history of philosophy because once you get to the Middle Ages, since you no longer have the scholars who have the ability to read Greek for the most part, there are some exceptions, but by far the majority of philosophers in the Middle Ages cannot read Greek. And that means that for many centuries, really up until about 1200, the only things they can read in Latin from classical philosophy are the Latin translations that were made in antiquity, and mostly that's Boethius. Their route to classical philosophy, and especially Aristotle's logic, is through the translations of Boethius. So he's very influential for that reason. They also read his commentaries. So that's one kind of work. The other kind of work is a group of works often called the theological tractates or treatises. And these are pretty short, but they're very dense. and they look at a variety of questions about Christian theological doctrine, often the Trinity or the Incarnation. And then what he does is actually very interesting. He tries to answer the problems, these theological problems, by using material from classical philosophy. So, for example, he tries to explain how the Trinity works by appealing to Aristotle's theory of relation, and says that the three persons of the Trinity are related to each other in the way that Aristotle describes, for example, a father being related to a son, which, you know, conveniently for him, that's the standard example. And of course, it's also the example that would be used in the case of the Trinity. We actually see here another example of how highly placed he was, because, and this is relevant for your podcast, some of these theological treatises are dedicated to John the Deacon, who turns out to be Pope John I, who reigned in the 520s and died right around the time that Boethius was put to death.
How have his works stood the test of time? They were very popular in the Middle Ages. Moving into the modern age, what do philosophers and academics, what do they, how would they assess his works today?
He's certainly very popular among medieval philosophy experts. So you can't really study medieval philosophy without knowing quite a bit about Boethius. And I think also medievalists in general would need to know about him, because, sort of straying away from my field for the moment, actually Boethius, because of the Consolation, has a big role to play in medieval literature. His Consolation was already translated into English by King Alfred, which is pretty cool. And that's maybe the most amazing thing about his medieval reception. But the Consolation as a literary work, which is also a philosophical work, influences a number of authors throughout the Middle Ages, like Dante, like Jean de Meun, the author of the Romance of the Rose, and like Chaucer. So all of these guys were reading Boethius, the Consolation, and therefore the Consolation is a kind of standard text that you need to know about if you're an expert on medieval literature. There are also some topics that Boethius touches on in his philosophy where modern day philosophers have thought his discussion is very interesting, and probably the most prominent example of that is a discussion that comes towards the end of the Consolation of Philosophy, where so one thing I should sort of make sure is clear is that the way that the Consolation works is you've got Boethius is the author, obviously, but he puts himself into the poem as a character, describes himself as a prisoner awaiting execution, and then has philosophy appear to him in the form of a woman. And she explains to him why what's happening to him is consistent with divine providence. They go through a bunch of philosophical problems together, Boethius, the character, and Lady Philosophy. And one of them, which, as I say, is the one that's attracted a lot of attention from modern day philosophers of religion, especially, is an issue about God's knowing the future. The problem here is, suppose we take an action of yours, something you'll do in the future, like, what are you planning to have for breakfast tomorrow morning? Yeah, you're supposed to answer the question, what you're having.
Oh, what did I? I thought it was a rhetorical
I was trying
question.
to do a dialogue, see, Socrates.
Oh, okay.
Here, I'll ask the question again. So, Steve, what are you planning to have for breakfast tomorrow morning?
Probably just coffee. I usually don't eat breakfast.
Okay, that's actually very bad, because breakfast is the most important meal of the day. But let's suppose that you're right. Your prediction is true, and that you will only drink coffee tomorrow morning. Well, if that's true, then God knows that that's what you'll do, that you'll drink coffee and not eat anything. And if God knows what you'll do now, already in advance, then it may seem that it's no longer in your power to do anything else, right? Because God can't be wrong. So intuitively, we could think, well, even though you are going to drink coffee, you could have done something else, right? You could have drunk tea, you could have had coffee and eggs, you could have done any number of things. But it looks like the fact that God already knows what you'll do forecloses all the other possibilities and leaves you unfree, because there's just only one thing you can do. And of course, God knows in advance everything that all of us will do. And so there's no freedom. And this problem, sometimes called the problem of divine foreknowledge, is one that Boethius takes up in the Consolation, and he has a very complicated discussion of it, which has been drawn on in the Middle Ages, for example, by Thomas Aquinas, but also by modern day philosophers of religion who are trying to solve the problem.
So that must have really opened the door to a lot of issues that later theologians and philosophers would talk about. Like you said, did Aquinas borrow heavily from Boethius?
Yeah, and in fact, so what the issue I just mentioned is a good example. Part of Boethius's answer to the problem is that it's wrong to think of God knowing what I'll do in advance, because actually God is outside of time or something like that. Is actually that's usually what people say Boethius means. It's not entirely clear that that's what he means. What he says is that God doesn't see the future by sort of looking ahead. Rather, he sees all of time stretched out before him, like someone watching a mountain range, which is laid out from left to right. In other words, God's way of seeing the past, the present, and the future is that he sees them all at once. And that's sort of the way that we see space laid out. We see a spatial field laid out all at once. Whether that's a good solution or whether that even is his whole solution is not so clear. But I mean, you can see why it might be a solution, right? Because now we can say, oh, well, God's just seeing everything as if it were happening now, which means that we don't even have to worry about divine foreknowledge. There's actually more to it than that. Boethius goes into more details. So I think that's not his whole solution, but it is something that comes up in Aquinas and many other medieval thinkers when they think about how God relates to time. They often say that God is eternal in the sense that he relates to past, present, and future simultaneously, as it were.
It's interesting the way that Boethius laid out the document. It starts with a prose and then goes into narrative, and that's how each chapter works. And like you said, it was a discussion between him and philosophy personified. Was that an innovation?
Yeah.
And then how did that influence later writers?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, this is one of the most innovative and important and influential features of the text. So certainly, I mean, for one thing, the whole kind of literary artifice of, and also, I mean, this is kind of psychologically amazing, right? So there you are waiting to be executed. To be fair, probably waiting for quite a long time in a pretty nice villa or something, but still, you're waiting to be executed and you still have the wherewithal to write this very contrived, complicated piece of writing where, as you said, you have an alternation between verse and prose. And that bouncing back and forth between poetry and prose is very influential and will be used by later authors in the Middle Ages. So, for example, Alan of Lille, who wrote a work called On the Complaint of Nature, uses the same kind of structure. And you have a lot of figures in the 12th century who do this as well. So that kind of literary device is one of the most lasting kind of legacies of Boethius.
There's an argument between whether this is a purely philosophical piece or a theological, and where Boethius, that some people say that since he didn't mention Christianity explicitly in the book, that it's really not a Christian piece. Where do you stand on that?
That's a good point. And in fact, it's even been doubted in the past whether the two Boethiuses are the same guy. So maybe there was the Christian guy who wrote the theological treatises and another Boethius who's a pagan, perhaps, who might have done the Aristotelian commentaries and most importantly is the author of the Consolation. And the reason for that is that it seems kind of astonishing that a Christian who's waiting to be executed should write a work in which he's being consoled about the fact that he's about to die, without ever mentioning anything about Christianity, which he doesn't. So he doesn't talk about Christianity at all through the entire Consolation. But nowadays, scholars universally agree that these works are all by the same person. So there's only one Boethius, so to speak. And the real question then becomes, well, given that this person who also wrote works on theology did write the Consolation, why does he not integrate Christian theology into the work? And I think the clue is kind of in the title, which is Consolation of Philosophy. When he sets the work up, what he's thinking is basically, what does the classical philosophical tradition have to say to someone in my position? And it turns out that philosophy has quite a lot to say. For example, she explains that the loss of wealth and even life is not actually something that should impair your happiness, because happiness lies in virtue, which is a classic Stoic position. She argues for the pervasiveness of divine providence, which of course is something Christians would agree with as well, but it again is more of a Platonic and Stoic doctrine, especially the way that Boethius sets it up. So I think that the idea is not that it's somehow an anti-Christian work or anything like that. It's just that the resources he's turning to here are the resources he knows about through his knowledge of Greek philosophy, which he's been translating, right, and reading for his whole career. And the fact that he doesn't mention Christian works is really a reflection of the type of treatise that he's trying to write. So he's trying to write a treatise from the point of view of an expert on classical philosophy, which means pagan philosophy.
Was he able, is this a completed work? Was he able to complete the final draft and have it the way he wanted it before his ultimate demise?
Well, I mean, actually, with medieval and ancient works in general, it's never, I guess it's almost never possible to know whether it's, so to speak, the final draft. What we can tell is whether a work cuts off in the middle or not. And this does not cut off in the middle, it finishes. So I think it's probably, and it's also a very polished, artful work in many ways. So it's very carefully put together. You have the balancing of the prose and the poetry and so on. So I don't think that it doesn't read like a first draft or anything like that. I think he probably had the chance to finish it before he was put to death.
What would be your final wrap up of Boethius? We've had a conversation about him. How does he affect you as a philosopher and philosophy in general, and just a final takeaways?
Well, for me, he's important because instead of seeing him as the first medieval philosopher, I really see him as the last late ancient philosopher, at least to write in Latin. So if you think about late ancient philosophy in general, people usually don't think of that as a Latin phenomenon, but they should, because there are these earlier church fathers. There's Augustine, and then there's Boethius. And Boethius, as I was arguing earlier, is really a creature of the late Roman period. He thinks of himself as an imperial citizen. He is a senator, for goodness sakes. And he is presumably quite confident that classical culture will continue. His worry isn't so much the dying out of this educational system that he was raised in. It's, can we get this stuff into Latin? And that's what he did. He played a big role in that. In fact, he played the leading role in transmitting Greek philosophy into Latin for the early Middle Ages. And I think that that's really his most important legacy, is as a transmitter of Greek thought into Latin, and as a kind of final installment in the story of philosophy in late antiquity. In fact, when I was doing the podcast and the book based on it about late antiquity, Boethius sort of comes along at the end of the book as the last thing you need to know about. And then you could sort of close the book and open a new book that's about medieval philosophy.
I think this was a great conversation about Boethius. I learned a lot, and it definitely made me think a little bit differently about him as a more of a bookend to the classical era, more so than the beginning of the medieval, that he really does fit specifically in that context. But before we go today, we do have a little bit of a bonus. part of this that we can't pass up on. You recently wrote a paper on Giles of Rome, and we're not quite there in the podcast, but this is a little sneak peek of what's coming. Can you tell us a little bit about your paper?
Yeah, so Giles of Rome is a figure I was actually reading up on from my own podcast because I was writing about the political philosophical debate about political authority in the early 14th century. And this guy, Giles of Rome, is a student and follower of Thomas Aquinas. So he's not a very famous philosopher by any means. He did write a really interesting treatise about papal authority. And he finds himself on the side of the debate that you'll be getting to and tell your listeners about between the King of France and Pope Boniface VIII, who is also the Pope that is described by Dante as being destined to come to hell, right? When he visits the circle of hell where popes are being punished, he's like, oh boy, just wait till Boniface VIII gets here. He'll be in big trouble. And the one reason Dante doesn't like Boniface VIII is that Dante is on the imperial side of the debate, right? So he thinks that secular power trumps church power and that basically the Pope should stay out of the emperor's way and just worry about spiritual matters. Whereas what Giles of Rome does is the reverse. He says that actually all power in human affairs stems from the Pope. This is sometimes called the plenitude of power, right? That the Pope has all the power and grants it to some other agents within society to use with his blessing, but he could sort of always take it back if he wants to. A good example would be the right to wage war. So the papist faction, which is represented by Giles, would say that there is the so-called sword of blood and earthly violence, which is wielded by the Pope rightfully, but can be handed to a secular power to wage war on behalf of the church. And here they're looking back to a passage in the Bible where Jesus hands St. Peter two swords. And so their idea is that there's the spiritual sword and the secular sword. So actually the Pope can wage war, which, as you know, the Pope sometimes did in the Middle Ages, but he can also allow the king or some other princely figure to wage war on his behalf. So Giles's work is called On Ecclesiastical Power, and it's basically a justification of that theory. And I mean, I didn't discover that. This is a pretty well-known work, but what I'm arguing in the paper is that he uses ideas from natural philosophy in order to explain how this works. So in particular, he draws a parallel between the way that God rules over the entire natural universe and the way that the Pope rules over society. So just as God providentially rules everything, but also allows natural causes to be efficacious. So, for example, when fire burns something, fire is kind of burning on God's behalf because God created it with causal power, the power to burn. So the Pope can grant some of his power to a lower authority like a king and say, okay, you go ahead and fight for me, or you go ahead and rule in a legal context. But just as God can perform a miracle and have fire not burn something, so the Pope could always, for example, step in and overturn a legal judgment by a secular court.
Was Boniface using Giles to help him further his goals? Because Boniface, he issued the Unum Sanctum, and he was pretty firm in papal power. Was Giles one of the driving forces behind that?
I think it's more the other way around. So Giles is not egging the Pope on. Boniface didn't need any egging. He was, in fact, I think Boniface's problem, it was, if one reason he wasn't a successful political figure, as you'll be explaining, is that he was just far too kind of bold and intemperate in his claims. So he didn't nuance what he was saying at all. And basically Giles just comes in and says, yeah, Boniface is right, and here's why he's right. So there's a lot of sort of retrospective justification of these papal bulls on the part of Giles. He also wrote another work, which this is a little bit complicated, but to make a long story short, this other work justifies why it was all right for Boniface's predecessor to voluntarily step down as pope, making way for Boniface, because some of the anti-Boniface political factions were saying that his papacy was illegitimate because the pope who he replaced should still be pope because he didn't lose power through a legitimate process. And again, Giles was saying, sure, he did, because you can step down if you want. Okay, maybe he was pressured into it, but the point is you can voluntarily stop being pope, which other people were denying. So he's really, I think, a kind of publicist and like polemicist on Boniface's behalf. But it's not like he's a driving force. It's much more like he's the intellectual reflection of the papal side of the debate.
After the papacy moved to Avignon after Boniface was more or less murdered, bullied into dying.
He put in jail until he died, basically. Yeah.
Was Giles popular at that time amongst the pro-Rome crowd?
I don't think that he has much kind of resonance in the later 14th century. I might be wrong about this because I really just tried to study this treatise. But as far as I know, he's not very influential with his pro-papal writings. He actually did write another work quite a few years earlier, which is a kind of piece of advice for a secular ruler. And it's part of a genre called Mirrors for Princes, where a philosopher sort of writes, here's how to be a good king. And this work that he wrote, his Mirror for Princes, it was incredibly popular. So it's preserved in many, many, many manuscripts and was translated into numerous languages and so on. And in fact, if people know about Giles, even as a political writer, they usually know about this earlier work of advice for kings and not these works of pro-papal polemic.
I think this was a wonderful conversation, and the listeners got a 2-for-1 deal with this podcast. If they want to, they should definitely go listen to your podcast if they're not already. Can you tell us where you can find your podcast?
Sure. So it's on iTunes. So you can just search for History of Philosophy podcast, but it also has a website if you don't want to use iTunes. And the website is www.historyofphilosophy.net. But actually, and this is kind of cool, you can literally just go into Google and Google History of Philosophy. And I think the first hit is Wikipedia and the second hit is my podcast.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you again for coming on. And I hope to talk to you soon. I think we'll have to have you on again at some point.
Well, thanks very much for having me on. It was a real pleasure.